very generous opening and then a very nice setup for this brief ramble around the campus here. I'm really, really pleased to have been invited back. I have got a kind of loose connection with the university now as a sort of cultural supply teacher. Never know quite where I'm going to bob up next, and it's always interesting. But the beginning of it all, and I must say, you know, talking about space and movement and places, there is something quite particular about this campus. I've been to a lot of them, and a lot of them have grown up like new towns in the kind of worst sense, in the sense that they sort of drain the energies out of the old town. This one somehow, in its setting on the top of the hill, looking down over the town and the cathedral, has an ambience. And what I like about it is you can choose to slog up that hill on foot from the town, from the station. You can walk up, you can think about where you're going, or you can get one of those buses. It all runs, it all works. It doesn't have that sense of having to grind through a retail park like you get in Essex University. Or a wonderful university I went to in Limerick recently, which is, I think, kind of combination of a university of tourism and music in a luxurious parkland sponsored by all kinds of strange and slightly dubious money. But everything around it is Tarkovsky. It's completely collapsed. You know, there's a history of collapsed supermarkets and sort of cowboy schemes that have died. And then beyond that, there is a kind of new economy of very high-level drugs. There's a lot of money washing about, a lot of aggravation, because Shannon Airport had to reinvent itself when they stopped having to stop there to refuel for the Atlantic trip, and a duty-free zone grew up around it, which is sort of Howard Marks territory. And then this university emerges from that. So these universities have always got quite interesting undercurrents, and we're in a conflicted and difficult moment in universities in general. And I find in the two opening addresses there the real spirit, you know, of what you want in terms of people who are engaged by the place, are very serious about their teaching, very addicted to the idea of a commune, of being useful, and yet the burgeoning bureaucracies and the political imperatives around it make this very difficult, so that some kind of action is demanded. When I first came to this university a few years back, it was for an event around the poet through the English school and David Hurd, who was quite an inspirational leader of that school, on the American poet Charles Olson. Charles Olson was, as well as being a poet, was quite a political figure. Had worked for the Roosevelt Democrats in Washington during the war and fallen out with them when certain things started to happen. And his big themes were human geography, pushing the ceiling back, finding out as much as he could about people like the Mayans and the Sumerians and the beginnings of language, and combining that with a highly charged open field poetic. And what I said then, and what I felt very strongly coming here, was I said, I'm happy to come to Canterbury to be part of this, but it's too rushed. You know, I felt as I made that journey, as I felt many times before, that I needed to walk it. I needed to walk here from London, and then I would be justified in saying something. And it couldn't happen because I had to be there such and such a time. And yet, strangely, now that I'm coming to the end of this period here, and I'll get around to that at the end, I have actually walked here. It haunted me for quite a long time. And the book that was mentioned, London Overground, began when I set out one morning I said, I've got to walk there. I walked down the Old Kent Road, and I was sort of setting off to come to Canterbury. And I got detoured by some strange figures who I thought maybe came out of Goldsmiths College, who were wearing goat masks and drums, and were heading back towards this overground railway, which just carried me straight back to Hackney, where I'd come from. And so the project I got walked into as a detour, I'm always ready to go sideways in space, was an event to do with discovering that this was the new London, that there was a kind of London that was railway based, that instead of metro line suburbs that would run you away from the centre, there was something that was neither centre nor suburb, but it reflected on the railway. New kinds of buildings, new build flats grew up that were positioned because they would get you somewhere else. So you lived on these flats as if you were in a kind of a boat. You know, you were sleeping overnight, but you were only there to make a voyage. And the spaces underneath the railways became crucial. There was a sort of uniformity of barista coffee, gyms, internet cafes of some sort, places that sold tiny microscopic fish for £2,000 in plasma screens as meditative devices. And this kind of spread around London. The bits it hadn't reached yet were still oily caves full of dubious things. But then the new London took over until there was a kind of tunnel, a ring around this railway. And that became very fascinating and worth exploring. And so, in fact, I never did make this journey to Canterbury. At the end of that single-day walk around London Overground Railway, which I thought, although I'd done bits and pieces myself, I decided to do the whole thing as a project in one day with Andrew Cotting, who I'd collaborated with before. And indeed, we did walk around it in a single day. But then he journeys to come back to the south coast where he lives in Hastings. And on the Old Kent Road, which we had walked past earlier in the day, he's hit by a motorbike and he has a very serious accident and his blood is pouring out of his leg. A Polish policewoman who happens to be there knows what to do, rescues him. He falls into a kind of black hole of consciousness in which, as it were for me, the whole book of our journey becomes a dream and plays through his head. With the nature of what the hospitals are and how difficult it is in some senses to acquire the treatment. This is a real emergency, so he gets it, but he sees other people who are struggling to get treatment being left in corridors. So he survives that and he wants to exorcise it by walking the same circuit in reverse. And I decide that the way to do this is at night, because that is a different city. The night city, the nocturnal city, is a kind of migrating dream. And as we leave Hackney, we see on a bench the figure of a man I write about in Last London, which is a person I call a vegetative Buddha. It's the man who sits in Haggerston Park all day long on a bench. He never moves an inch. And he seems to sort of anchor London just by his presence. And I've never seen him outside that park. Well, here we are setting off for the night walk. He's moved 100 yards onto another bench on Kingsland Road, but he keeps his back to the traffic. He waits till the moment he can go back into the park. So I tell Andrew Cotting all about this. And in a way, this is how stories work and how mappings work, is that two people or three people or however many people you walk with, male, female, whatever it would be on this journey, exchange reminiscences and confessions as they move. It becomes a wider prospect. You're looking at a more panoramic view as the two of you walking side by side as you cross the landscape. And I tell him the story of this man, and we move into darkness. The darkness falls. John Rogers, who's been mentioned, was with us initially, was scampering along, running alongside, making a film. He peels off by the time we get to Hampstead, and we carry on to the next section. And then a lovely dreamlike quality spreads over London. But it's almost as if you could feel the same images that people are dreaming in Willesden and rippling through and carrying on right down to Shepherd's Bush and down to the crossing of the river. We stop by the Thames and sit on a bench and finish off some brandies. It's very, very cold. And he starts to tell a story about Hastings. This is the way it works, about sitting on the bench a couple of nights back in Hastings, and he sees two young women go down, and it's very stormy, very wild, and they take off their clothes and plunge into the sea, and he can't believe it. He can't believe they're not going to be drowned. It's like some mythical thing, and yet they emerge perfectly well and they move away. He tells this story as we sit and look at the Thames. And very shortly afterwards, we reached the hospital in which he had been a patient, and we walk into the hospital in the dark. on security cameras and all the rest of it, but unchallenged, emerge on the other side and come out into the light. And I take him back early next morning, as soon as the park opens. We're arriving back in Hackney, and the guy is now sitting on his bench, and Andrew passes him with a GoPro camera on his head and takes an image. And this is clearly a mistake. It's like lifting somebody from a mythical sense of the city into some kind of recorded or documented city. And when I go back later that day, he's gone, and he's never seen again. He's vanished. And that kind of strange sense of space and place is the consciousness of someone who can just sit, and the consciousness of someone who has to move. I felt there's sort of neurosis in what I've been doing all these years, thinking that journeys can reveal what you need. The poet Charles Olson had this phrase, which I'm bringing him back because he was an influence on me as a poet and as geographer when I was a student. This is back in the early to mid 60s in Dublin. And Olson had two things: the idea of the open field poetics, which was that instead of writing a closed-off lyric traditional form, he would wanted to use a kind of poetic that involved his research into fishing in Gloucester, Massachusetts, into how the city was settled, into letters that people had sent, into information he could gather, into fragments and images, into Homeric realities, and to somehow you could shape it and include it, and there was a sort of form that remained open. So all my writing began with that, the idea that could combine poetry, prose, documentation, filmmaking. All these would come into a single form, which was to do with space and to do with movement. And then secondly, Olson had a statement: I take space to be the central fact in America. You know, this idea of this hugeness of this country, of these people who had settled on the very edges of an enormous continent that was aggressive and against them, the wilderness that they had to deal with, and then the kind of brutalities they had to apply to create a polis, a town, a civilization out of this, and to confront the indigenous peoples, and indeed to slaughter so many of them, and to create this kind of culture that we've ended up with. So I had those ideas in mind, and I also had the idea that I really somehow had to justify being in Canterbury by doing this walk or pilgrimage, which is so much a part of English culture. And that, I think, if I was going to give you an outline of how it had worked for me, quite sort of things that seem accidental turn out not to be. And I think our biographies occur in space and in movement. And I grew up in South Wales, and the small town I lived in, about 30,000 people, 27,000 people, mining town as it was then. It seemed that everybody knew everybody, so you're moving through a surveyed landscape, not in the way that the City of London became surveyed in the 80s and 90s by cameras, but just because your histories were known. You were not liberated entities, you were entities as part of, you belonged to, you know, so-and-so family, your relations, everything was known about you. And to do the kind of writing I wanted to do was to be a kind of spy, you know, was to infiltrate a culture about which I knew very little and to make a record of it. So as soon as I had the chance, I came to London, where you were completely anonymous, but yet the possibilities were absolute, and my ignorance was also absolute. So living and going to a film school in Brixton meant that I was sort of exploring the weird, strange, dead suburban streets of South London. And also the topography was really important, the way the hills were, the way settlement developed along certain lines, and then using the railway lines to move about London in terms of searching out things I needed to do. And it became an obsession. You know, I didn't know this was going to define the way that I was going to work until I came back to London after being in Dublin for a few years, and how to make a living. And in those days it was very easy to pick up sort of casual jobs and work for a time, save some money, and then go off and do your writing, whatever you wanted to do. And what I worked at first was a place called Chobham Farm. It's a wonderful, pastoral sounding. Angel Lane, Chobham Farm. Sounds wonderful. It's Stratford East, in fact, exactly where the Olympic Park grew up. And what it was then was alongside a railway line, a series of large sheds in which goods from the docks were put into containers and moved inland to bypass, as I didn't realise, but they were basically bypassing the docks and the unions and all of the difficulties that were in the Port of London with shipping. And it was really the death knell of what had been London as a kind of maritime port, and a shifting inland to these cowboys who were hiring the cheapest labour, which was me, and a bunch of other people. It was a wonderful bunch there. Everybody was slightly under the radar. Everybody was hanging on by their fingernails, and yet we had a sense of community. The work was really dirty and dangerous, and you were shifting appalling cargoes, stinking sheet casings and all the rest of it for very little money. And soon it erupted into a strike. This was called politicisation without me noticing it. My take on this landscape was it was like Allen Ginsberg or Kerouac writing about sunsets in San Francisco out by the rail yards with giant sunflowers, and the romance of that kind of landscape, not seeing the reality that very soon hundreds of dockers would be blocking the access to this place because they saw their livelihood, which was very controlled and kind of family jobs inherited. And that actually was the beginning of the end of that kind of London. And I also had the sense then that most of the jobs I did were obituaries, because by the time they let me into work, whatever I was in was doomed. So the job that followed this was in Truman's Brewery in Brick Lane. And at that time, this is again another kind of London. Truman's were a Quaker family, and they were reckoned to be very good employers. They provided housing. Earlier times they provided schooling for the children of the people who worked there. They were kind of benevolent in the best sense, as well as paying well. So it was a very desirable job. Not only that, and it's horrifying to think of it now, there was a free bar, and the drivers who delivered beer around the various pubs or brought back the slops, which is what I dealt with, had as much drink as they wanted. So they basically were into this bar, and when they could hardly stand, they were back into their lorries to deliver. It was terrifying, but it was that kind of London. And the people who worked there, like the old boys who I got to know very well, had stories of fire watching in the war. They had a sense of having come through the battle, and the streets meant a lot to them. The space was the space they knew, which was generally a series of public houses, a series of markets they went to, certain moves they made around the streets, exactly how they behaved. You could map it. It was a pattern. But at that very same moment, the whole brewery was acquired by Maxwell Joseph, who was a sort of asset-stripping developer. He said he was going to keep it all going, but in reality what he did, it was a portrait by Hogarth. He sold that straight off and put up a fake. And he bought up all the land between the brewery and the railway, and essentially he saw ahead of everybody else, the hipster, retro, new London that's now Shoreditch. All that stuff was there, visible to the kind of the visionaries of capital in the 1970s. And on the other extreme, the kind of non-visionary labouring poets, which is what I was getting into the same picture. So my sense of London in terms of space is exactly by the accident of these jobs I was doing. Luckily for me, after that, the third series in this series of jobs was as a gardener, and again this has disappeared. The gardeners that were responsible for planting all the schools, it was very much like this landscape out here. We went around all the schools in East London, planted flowers, looked after the trees, cut the grass, and also we were responsible for the Hawksmoor churches. St Anne's Limehouse, St George in the East, I used to cut the grass there. pick up all the empty sherry bottles that had been smashed by the drinking schools that were there, tidy things up. And while I was doing it, I began to contemplate the nature of these churches. Was there, because we drove around from one Hawksmoor church to the next, there seemed to be actual patterns or lines or alignments to do with these particular kinds of building. So if you went up on the top of the hill in Blackheath, one of the great vantage points in London, top of Greenwich Park, you could see that St Anne's Limehouse was exactly between the two sides of the Naval College that Hawksmoor had also worked on. The geometries were very precise. It was very remarkable to me. I hadn't seen that sense of a civic London, planned London, with these white buildings across East London. And I began to write about that in a way that I was keeping a daily record of my life as it was in the work. There's strange things that were happening, the small corruptions that were going on around the deals that were done between the managers and various suppliers of goods, all this sort of stuff. And at the same time, the grander picture of the architecture of the city, and the space, and how it works. And how when Hawksmoor was building these churches, he really wanted to demolish whole lines of houses so that you'd get a better sight line onto the church. The churches were dominant, but they were also empty. They were like dead dynamos. Nobody went to them at that point. They were locked up. It's very hard to get in. And so that is, again, the sort of next stage in the politicization of space. And I was very intrigued by that. And despite all else, the structure of the buildings themselves were like wonderful, wonderful imaginary pieces of architecture, so resonant of a deep study of architecture as well as craft and workmanship, because Hawksmoor worked his way up as an assistant to Wren and was a sort of site manager, really, working on St Paul's and doing this. So by now I've got some sense of London as a political entity, which leads into the Thatcherite period. When it appeared that the thing, I suppose, was to go into a kind of Baroque fiction. Nothing was real. Everything was sort of extreme and cartoon-like at that period. And I saw this beginnings of this sort of fake news, false news, grand statements that meant the opposite. And the gradual process that we're now seeing with the universities of cutting funds. No such thing as society. You know, everything has to justify itself immediately in financial terms. Burgeoning bureaucracy, you create enormous bureaucratic classes, and the cutting-edge people who are out there doing the work are the ones that are always pinched at. So I was working in that territory, particularly in a book called Downriver. And Downriver took on the landscape of the new and reinvented Thames. The dock world I described at the beginning had now become kind of drop-in city. The things on Canary Wharf were embedded in the landscape without there being any infrastructure. So in terms, it didn't really work initially, but of course, gradually, as time goes on, it does work, because the city absorbs all these things. And in the book Last London, and I just want to read a little bit to give you a kind of flavour of how it sounds and works. I revisited that landscape of the docklands and the Thames estuary, all of which is being swallowed up rapidly now, on the day of Margaret Thatcher's funeral, because I had the idea, you know, that this was her elegy in a sense. This is the landscape that she had envisioned, and what did the people living there now think about her? So I ended up in a sort of cafe in Tilbury, Old Town. And nobody thought of her at all. There was like stuff that was playing on TV, but nobody took a blind bit of notice. And the only person that turned up there was another journalist who was desperate to find someone to talk to. So she bought me a cup of coffee, and then she found I was doing the same thing as she was. Anyway, at the end of this day, which took me on right down to the Isle of Sheppey, I came back on a train to Stratford. And I want to just read that, because there's a kind of interesting link to Donald Trump at this point. You know, I'm saying all along, if you read the landscape, you look at the buildings, you keep your eyes open, the future reveals itself way ahead of the game. I quote a bit from Patrick Wright, who's a fine writer who lived in near me in Hackney for a time, and who was at the University of Kent. I think he even has a doctorate from here. I returned by way of Stratford International, which involves a compulsory detour through the labyrinth of Westfield Superstore. This is one of the real kind of horrors of the time in terms of geography. And I saw this early on. I was wandering around and I saw a maquette of what the Olympic site was going to be. I said, "What's this?" They said, "Oh, that's Westfield Supermarket." So it actually looked like Westfield. The development was Westfield Supermarket with a few add-ons and a kind of retail park beyond it. And sure enough, Westfield became the kind of defining thing, that if you wanted to get into the Olympic site, you had to pass through Westfield. And if you wanted to come into Stratford International, you had to go right through this Westfield Mall to get out back onto the tube. So this is where I was. So it involved a compulsory detour through the labyrinth of Westfield Superstore. At the conclusion of my Thames Estuary tour, I at last found images of Lady Thatcher. There was a strategic window display in Waterstones, The Iron Lady by John Campbell, Thatcherism, a graphic guide, shoppers marching to the beat of piped music, do not pause, throwaway bundles of the London Evening Standard with a flag-draped coffin have been rammed into a silver bin along with polystyrene coffee cups, crisp packets and energy drinks. The headline in the Hackney Gazette as I plod home is not Thatcher related, even though it sounds as if it ought to be. It's local and ordinary, and it's just another tale of failed services and burdensome bureaucracy. Body locked in morgue for weeks. Such fortuitous ironies were always noticed by Patrick Wright. He had, as he demonstrated on the walks we took in the high Thatcherite days, an eye for the telling detail and the coming horror, anticipated in the crack of paving stone or a vanished telephone kiosk. A journey through ruins conjured from a couple of hundred yards between his home on St Philip's Road and Dalston Lane bus stop or bus queue reached out to the world at large, and his polemic or curse on the corruptions of locality was dedicated to Lady Margaret Thatcher, the woman who had done so much to inspire our silenced poets and our cultural historians. Way back in 1991, Wright used the Hackney Gazette, as I did, for divination. In a report on the hubristic plans of a bankrupt council for a lavish upgrading of Hackney Town Hall, the Dalston pundit heard the elephantine shudder of much heavier footprints in the apotheosis of Donald Trump. In the shameless marble floors and curved glass walls, Wright recognized an elective affinity with the retail atrium of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue in New York City. He also recognized a moral vacuum at the heart of this king of bullshit. Trump, he said, was a smudged deadbeat left over from the Reagan era and propped up in a temporary kind of way by ailing US and Japanese banks that couldn't afford to let him expire completely. The master builder, the post-truth artist of the deal, was a perma-tanned bagpipe held in place by weight of hair. I don't do it for the money. I've got more than I will ever need. All this trumpeting Inflatable was waiting for was the invention of worldwide social media, so that slavish followers were hungry for the latest jab of his thumb. Insane ambition, as Wright demonstrated, was hiding in full sight. Commentators sneered. It could never happen. If Trump was in the White House, which he was rash enough to hint, even in those undiminished days he might well be before too long, he would follow the examples of President Reagan and Harding and look for astrological anchorage in the stars. The big man appreciated, like a true mafioso, that you can trust family in a way you can never trust anybody else. You can rob a country blind and they'll still vote you into power, your kin and your billionaire cohorts. Just wind the story right back and it eventually delivers onto the steps of Hackney Town Hall in 1991. So that's kind of how it works. And it's quite an interesting way that in this landscape, you just do find those traces. And so the encounter with Andrew Cotting, which was described already, for me was one whereby he was a kind of blind source of energy. He was somebody whose difficulties in his life, and it is, Eden, who was the subject, his daughter, who was the subject of the film Gallivant in a very moving way in her relation with her old granny, and 8 years old, was not supposed to survive the Joubert syndrome, became, through the whole trajectory of Andrew's work, a kind of muse, but also a kind of goad, because he had to supply her energy. She was physically strong, but there was a kind of disconnect, and she wouldn't fire up to do anything unless he made her do it. And he had the responsibility in the evening to insist that she eat something, otherwise she wouldn't. And she knew how to play him and blackmail him to do that. So it's a very challenging and very difficult relation for someone who wants to be tearing about. So essentially the energy to erupt into these projects like the John Clare Walk or taking a swan pedalo from Hastings to London were always based on the idea of this darkness that had to be countered by this energy. And in the same way, I feel that I'm trapped in the space of a single room, producing all this material, accessing all this material, evaluating the strange researches, and looking for the excuse to get back out there into the next journey. And Andrew was a very, very useful conduit for that. And at the end of the book, Last London, we do a walk at the time of Brexit from Waltham Abbey down to the site of Battle Abbey on the coast, and then back to St Leonard's, where there is a beautiful elegiac statue of Edith Swanneck, who was the mistress or wife, early wife of Harold, and is cradling the dead king, which had haunted me for a long time. So we make this great walk at the moment the vote is being taken, and everybody on the walk, as we move through London, feels sort of relatively confident that this connection with Europe, emotionally and culturally and whatever, can't be broken, and the city seems to be in support of that. But as soon as you cross the M25, one of these arbitrary borderlines, the whole atmosphere changes, and by the time we're in Tunbridge Wells, and we're moving through estates with all these vote leave notices everywhere, and I tried to photograph one, I was almost lynched, and I realised the whole thing is turning, and it's not going to be okay after all. It's all going to be a major, major change for all of us, especially somewhere like this that's posited as being a European university with a Parisian campus and an outward-looking thing. It's closing in, and the journey closed in. And I felt at the end that this is now the moment, finally I am going to walk to Canterbury. So I wrote in the book this description of an overnight walk from Hastings non-stop, the walk to Canterbury, because that's what the book needed. But unfortunately it was a complete lie, because I didn't have time to do it. I'd reached my deadline on the book. Everybody was pressing me to get it. And I'd just written this big walk, and I thought, actually, I don't need another long walk piece is going to bore everybody to death, so I'll just make it up. And so I essentially made it up, but from bits and pieces of other walks I'd authentically done. And so it's a kind of slightly fictive end to the story. But of course that wasn't the end to the story, because there's appalling guilt there that you've written this thing that's not true. So as soon as possible, I did gather Andrew together, and we did walk to Canterbury, and he made a short film of this on his phone, and it was a really beautiful walk. It was because it felt like it wasn't part of a project. I'm not exploiting the territory to get material out of it. I was doing it because it was the kind of end of, I'd done the last London, I was freed up, and it almost felt like we floated as far as the sort of section from Dover to Canterbury was golden. It was a bit strange, because maybe about 12 miles out or something, there was suddenly a signpost that said Canterbury 4 miles. It's mad. you know, and so we walked for the next 6 miles, and then there was another one that said Canterbury 10 miles. So I realised there's somebody out there sort of either playing psychogeographical games to keep it interesting, or it was some sort of leftover from the war where they wanted to confuse the invaders. But you could have been walking in circles around Canterbury forever. But then the walk from Canterbury, if you stay, I was trying to stay on Watling Street and you walk to Faversham and so on, it's a really appalling road, and there's just hammering traffic all the way. And you just get into a kind of treadmill-like of walk, and it was like, I shouldn't have left Canterbury, you know, everything up to Canterbury was good. So something is being said here. And I began to think of the processions, the pilgrimages that have gone on from Canterbury with David Hurd, the refugee project in the high summer, which I've kind of tapped in and out of from time to time. There were all kinds of things, but nevertheless, that was where I ended. How am I doing for time? Probably just about done. Yeah? Okay.
If you feel...
I'll just finish with, because it's quite, I love the way this works. You know, we were talking, I was waiting in the Anthropology and Conservation, Anthropology and Conservation, very nice kind of hallway. I'm just standing waiting for a few minutes. There's a glass cabinet, and in this cabinet I've propped up some books. And one of the books was not downriver, but upriver, and it was a picture of an indigenous person on the Amazon, and there was a whole section of Amazonia. And I realized that what this defined is my next project, absolutely. It was there ahead of me. It was an illustration of something I hadn't done. Because for years, at the back of all this that I've been telling you already, where it's come from is not quite as simple as place. It's also biological, it's built in. I discovered my great-grandfather, who was Scottish, who came from a very small village north of Aberdeen, and was a self-taught sort of plantsman, had been sent off at about 15 to go to Ceylon, as it then was, to learn about planting coffee and tea. And it had a very interesting life. I won't go through all that now, but the interesting point is that in the 1890s, when everything had gone belly up, he was sent by the Peruvian Corporation of London to explore some territory in Peru, really dangerous, unexplored territory. He was being paid by the month with the expectation that they wouldn't have to pay out too much. And he wrote a book about it. And when I came to read this book, I realized it was exactly my own style of writing. And there were maps, and there were drawings, there were photographs, there was everything I would like to do. But it was sort of better done than I would do it. And instead of it being messing about on the A13, it actually was in a seriously challenging and difficult environment. And yet behind that there's all this other story. There's a story of how Peru as a country was pretty much bankrupt after the war with Chile, that they'd given huge tranches of land to the Peruvian Corporation of London, very Conradian, and they had sent off, they were going to build railways and mines, but there was a huge amount of territory that was just jungle along the sources of the Amazon, and they wanted to know if you could exploit this. And what my great-grandfather was very good on in terms of his journey, he's quite a funny writer, all kinds of strange picaresque adventures. He's very satirical about the guides they get who are Catholic priests and missionaries who behave incredibly badly and only stay with them while they can provide the drink. And then when the last drink is gone, they steal the medicinal rum and disappear, leaving them in the back end of nowhere with this tribal group who've never gone beyond a range of about 6 or 8 miles. And my grandfather persuades them to make balsa rafts, and they take off on a 40-mile river expedition until they hit these rapids, and it finishes. And that's strangely the point where Herzog made Fitzcarraldo. So it's all, all these interesting connections are there. And seeing this journey in Canterbury and seeing this wind, the book, upriver, downriver, it seemed in a sort of sense prophetic and right that the journey I've been trying to tease out of a small patch of ground in London, gradually moving from the labyrinth at the centre of the city out to the limits of the city with the M25, where, you know, this is where the future argued with the past very dramatically. This is where the sort of Thatcherite moment of abolishing local government and opening up the motorway years too late, and creating the open financial markets, all those things in London happened at one point, and it happened around that road. And so this is a very intriguing landscape to describe, where the hospitals were disappearing, the asylums were going, all of the things like we associate with essential to society. Hospitals, schools, universities, you know, those things were being put aside for private estates, retail parks, etc., belonging there because of the road. So in a sense, the step beyond that is obviously back into a kind of landscape of imperial dream, exploitation, adventure, all the things that are Amazonian. And my daughter, in ways, researched it much more thoroughly than me, because she heard her grandfather, my father's stories about it, and listened to them more carefully than I did. And it's sort of very interesting to see that come through another stage. And maybe that's what I'll talk about next time I come. Okay.
Thanks very much, Iain. We've got about 20 minutes for questions and answers, question and answer session. Anyone got any questions? I'll begin with one. There's a sense perhaps that, I mean, you were initially termed as a psychogeographer at some point. There's a sense now that psychogeography has become a bit of a buzzword. You know, it's been hipsterfied or gentrified, as much as gentlemen with curly cute moustaches in Shoreditch. Do you think this to be true, that the term psychogeography has become a bit lazy or something of a trope?
Yeah, I think it's complicated because it was very specifically a term that emerged from situationism, letterism in Paris at a particular point. A specific group of people who saw it as a critique of society and as a way of dealing with cities in terms of conceptual readings of a city and a kind of aggressive polemic. So it all belonged there. It belonged historically in a certain point. And I think what happened in England was that theorists here saw it as a satirical device. Round about I was saying with the Thatcher period, I was falling into writing kind of Baroque fictions as the only way of dealing with it. And people like Stuart Home were then borrowing the ideas of classic psychogeography and applying them to a more English version that took in the things I was saying about ley lines and Hawksmoor churches and shoved them together and used them in an absurdist way to criticise Thatcherism. Subsequent to that, it's kind of diffused into a massive range of activities, but as I think you suggested, more than anything else, it became a brand name, and nobody's quite sure what of. It seems to just represent vaguely walking,
yes,
taking photographs, making kind of derives of various sorts. I think I met John Rogers for the first time when he was undertaking psychogeographic projects in somewhere unlikely, like, I don't know, not London. I mean, because a lot of this activity was London-based, then it started to spread out, and it still goes on. And I think some of the methods are very valid, but I think the term has become so elastic; it's almost meaningless. I think it also related in the 1960s. One of the big influential events on me was this conference, the Dialectics of Liberation, which took place in 1967 in the Roundhouse, where all kinds of anthropologists, anti-psychiatrists, poets, black power activists, who were all mingling and arguing. And the terms they were using a lot was psychopolitics, and psychogeography kind of slept in on the back of that. And it was a way I kind of just sort of re-energizing those disciplines and making them questioned in a way that the events of 1968 brought into focus. So I think, maybe seeing what's happening here now, it's time to either bring them back or re-energize them. Yes.
Thank you for that talk, Iain. I enjoyed that very much. One question that I think links a lot of the writing that you've been producing for a long time with what's happening around us at the moment is this question of ownership. I was involved in a project which is ongoing in London called Inspiral London, and in fact it was at Swedenborg Hall that there was a big event with Inspiral London, which is a series of walks around London. And I've also been involved in a wonderful project, two projects here in Kent, one in the campus to do with trees, and the other in town, a fellow, but I think he sent you a copy of his book. It's called Matthew Watkins.
I just got it this morning.
Oh, brilliant.
I hadn't looked in my cubbyhole for a while.
Oh, fantastic. It's a great book.
I literally just picked it up.
And in all these different projects that I've been involved in, and I know this comes across again and again in your books, is this idea of who stakes the claim on the land. Now, for example, in Spiral London, they were finding that they were doing a walk and suddenly an old established thoroughfare, a right-of-way, a byway, is blocked. And it's blocked because of a building project. And when they start to inquire as to whether they're going to have access once the project is finished, no, sorry, right-of-way is gone. The riverfront, for example, in the Thames, whole areas of the riverfront are no longer accessible. And one of the things that's been emerging in all this current turmoil within the university sector is that we are all stakeholders, but only one group has claimed ownership, and they are making the decisions on behalf of everyone else. And one of the things I think that is challenged by, for example, the question of so much of this sort of genre of psychogeography is to say, actually, pan out a little bit, and you realise that land has always been this thing. It's always been this contested space between those who claim ownership and act with that ownership, and others who contest that ownership. And I find it really amazing to think that this is something that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, and will no doubt continue. And we're right in the heart of it right now.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the crucial ones to me was the poet John Clare. Because John Clare is in a small village in Clinton, Hubston, and it's enclosed. It's the moment of agricultural enclosure. So that, and it's so clear with Clare because he's a writer who has a mental landscape. He knows physically every inch of the spread around his own village, and that becomes the land of his poetry. In that when he goes beyond that, he speaks of going out of his knowledge because the animals, the birds, the stones, the trees don't recognize him, so therefore he doesn't exist. Who is he when he goes beyond that? And suddenly, almost overnight, common ground where they can all go is enclosed. You can't go on it. And socially, some of the small farmers try and go up a social grade and then reinvent themselves and take on airs and graces, which he's satirical about. But they also say, you can't come through my land. My land, it is the land of the imagination. It's the land of the writing of someone who, as a poet, has claimed it in a sense more than anybody else. Because he's true to what was going on there. He's adopted all the folk songs of people who've been there for generations. And then there becomes the division between those who move, the travelling people, who carry their culture with them and don't have land, they endlessly drift and move. The ones who suggest he escapes from the asylum of the Epping Forest and walks away, and the people who are deciding to lay a claim to land which they maybe not had a claim to before. Prior to this, the whole land belongs to two massive landlords. Afterwards, it's kind of split up into little parcels. People begin to emerge in a new class. And that battle has gone on ever since. When they tried to do the same enclosures in London around grazing grounds, the local people tore down the fences in some places. They wouldn't have it. They said, no, the Lammas land is too significant. And it actually remained in common ownership for a time. And the thing that happened with the Olympics that most engaged the local people who were using this landscape in the same way as their mental landscape was that suddenly fences were up and you couldn't see. You couldn't only the vision was no longer there. And somebody, eventually Gurkha's regiment, was telling you, you cannot go here. And people who tried to take photographs are having their cameras removed and the memories trashed. I think these are really big things. I think that's a completely significant theme in our way of life. And everything kind of depends on that sense of ownership. And is it an ownership that you can impose from outside and above by arbitrary rule, or is it an ownership of love of the people who got to know it and learnt it and have the landscape? What Andrew Cotting was calling desire lines when I was talking with him, the places you couldn't go through, but your heart told you this is the way you must go through. So there are, in the kind of walks and things I've been doing, there's constant confrontations. Lots of people who make their art around these absurd confrontations, because again, the people who stop you and challenge you are not the ones who are to blame. If they're very low rent, they're subsistence people who can only get these jobs. They're ordered to stop you doing whatever you do, and there is no authority to appeal to. It's sort of arbitrary and invisible somewhere else. And I think it also reflects into the whole business of taking images as well. That becomes your image is constantly taken whether you like it or not. But there are so many places you are not allowed to take an image because you might be a terrorist threat.
Thank you very much, Iain. I had one question for myself and two comments, questions inspired by other people. One was sitting right behind me, actually. One was about Kent Canterbury. Just a little anecdote that we thought about, and there's a tunnel that goes underneath the university.
Right.
And at this political moment, we were just thinking about tunnels underneath buildings and what that means, and what English people can do inside it. Anyway, that was just
What is the tunnel that goes through?
It was the first railway.
The Crab and Winkle. When Cornwallis Northwest was being built, in the late 1970s, it collapsed into the tunnel. They had to rebuild the building. But
what date is the tunnel?
1840s or 1850s. It's the oldest commercial passenger railway line in the world,
right.
And it goes from Canterbury to Whitstable. It's called the Crab and Winkle.
Oh right.
And it goes.
Yeah.
It was.
So you can follow this track now.
No, well, you can't, but
I mean, not underground.
But the tunnel's completely blocked because it collapsed and they never cleared it out. But there are. Sorry, throw that one.
So that was just one anecdote related to locally. Right. The second one was, what do you think about people who cycle rather than walk? Just because you.
Again, it's like I've got a big chapter on cycling in this book. In theory, I'm in favour of it, of course, because it's better than a lot of other things. But it's become a kind of a very aggressive element, certainly in sort of hipster parts of London, because the cycling demographic has taken over, say, the canal paths, which are very narrow, and gradually spilled into pavements and rejig parks, all kinds of things. So there's a kind of a blind eco-terrorism involved with cycling. To the point where the thing that really triggered it for me was in London Fields. There was this huge table brought out by the council saying, and people shouting, "Free breakfast for bicycles." Yeah. So, what about the rest of us? Seeing this old guy couldn't even cross the road. There were so many mad pelotons of bicycles going past to get anywhere near this free apple, which he didn't have the teeth for anymore. There's a kind of cycling politics which I'm very dubious of, but obviously cycling in itself, and there are some great people who do it who I have a lot of respect for.
And so my actual question quickly was, how do you deal with the more epistemology question? How do you deal with, so I was just writing a piece, and when you first go through this village, it looks like it's falling apart, or it's not particularly beautiful.
Where is it?
It's in Cyprus, where I grew up. And then in
North?
the middle, North Cyprus. And then in the middle you've got all of the nationalist busts and so on and so forth. So there's an immediate type of psychogeography, what do you get that way? But then as soon as you start not walking and sitting down there, then you start to discover a whole different community that is actually there. So I wondered how you balance that between that like moving through somewhere versus the sitting somewhere.
Well, that's again, that's the whole crux of this book, is this debate between this man I pick out as an example, but a lot of others who essentially sit unmoving within a landscape, either because they're completely damaged or because they've just lost jobs and everything and are just sitting and not moving. And then the neurosis of the others, like if you were moving through this village, presumably you're questing to kind of read the village, and the walks and journeys I'm doing are a kind of form of colonialization, really, because I'm imposing my own consciousness on a landscape which doesn't belong to me, but I'm reading it and making something of it. And that's different from the people who sit and are actually becoming a part of the landscape. So the division is between the two and the dialogue between the two. And as far as the general one in London was, there is no dialogue between the two, because the ones who sit have become completely embedded and enfolded. And even when people talk to this guy, he didn't want to know, he didn't want to accept anything from them, he just didn't want to be bothered. And most of the people rushing around walking don't notice. So you've got two kinds of consciousness there. And I guess from my point of view, the thing is to combine them. That you do this rushing around, but you reach a point which you describe where you have to stop. You sit down and you kind of you take a breath, you talk to somebody. And then the great thing on the walk is that from the state I described at the beginning, where people are walking in a line and exchanging stories, and then they tire, they go into a pub or something and they sit. Now they're looking at each other and they have a different kind of exchange, a social exchange. People talk more freely. So I think we just learn to use both methods and to see what comes out.
Actually, if I remember rightly, seeing London Overground, John films, where you take time and you sit in a graveyard.
Yeah.
And you can pause the clip.
I like those times. For the times you do the things like sit in a graveyard, the entire walk or whatever has gone before was part of the sitting in the graveyard.
Yes, yeah.
Rather than as a kind of, it was a TV play or whatever, you can just jump straight into the people sitting in the graveyard. You don't. It doesn't matter where they've come from or what they're doing, it emerges in the dialogue. Whereas for me, and in terms of architecture, I think this is important too. It's not just to drop something in from the heavens, but it's got to incorporate whatever surrounds it and what leads up to it and gives it its form and life.
I mean, obviously you find new journeys to make, and you very almost ceaselessly questing, but you also enjoy retreading walks. How important is it to revisit the same route?
Yeah, I think very, very, very important, because I do revisit the same route every single day, just small route, and it changes. And that kind of gives you a terrific sense of your own locality, just to see these microscopic changes in people and place by going around it. But in the grander scheme of things, it's really good, I find, to go back on old journeys and reinterrogate them. Like the sort of Downriver territory was so different from the time I was initially investigating it in the 1980s to how it is now. It's almost a different city. I meant to say that the most important and significant moment in all this for me seemed like completely trivial and nothing. Was that one day walking around the M25, I was with the photographer Mark Atkins, who'd been logging a lot of earlier projects, not digitally, but he with the old style, the analog camera, and his mobile phone rings. That's the first time I've ever seen a mobile phone. And his girlfriend rings up and says, "What do you want for someone?" This was such a shocking thing to me, because you're in this mode of walking and thinking and doing all this, and then this intrusion from out, it's like being tagged, you know.
Mhm.
I thought this is quite strange. And then I realised that this is actually the world that was going to come.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, we're drowning it. It's gone. You know, you if you were walking it, you would be more in that world than you were in the other world. And it's happened very, very fast. And that was, you know, it wasn't that long ago that this technology first emerged. It was really unusual to have one of these phones. And now it's swept us away.
Can I just ask a question on that, because it builds on that? I mean,
Yeah.
how do you think, given your last London is all about a different version of London's going to emerge, and in some sense you capture these people on the mobile phone saying, so is it?
Yes.
And my question to you was how, given that your work is anticipating a new London, how your writing would have to change, or indeed is this like not just the last London, but it's like sort of the last Sinclairian sort of. You do you see what I mean? So the question is, what modes of analysis would you? How could you capture this world which is floating above the city?
I don't know. I can't do it. You know, the idea is not. It's not the last London as a city.
No,
obviously
quite,
London
exactly.
evolves, but it's the last one that I feel I'm justified in describing, because my methods they've gone, you know, and if you were going to do it now, you would have to do it, I think, in a very different way, using different technologies, and the actual architecture of people working their way through large books is also vanishing. You know, I've had people, students, people are doing papers, whatever, and they've never read one of the books. I said, well, which book? No, they don't read the books. They've got all the information they want, seen things on YouTube, and you know, seen a bit here and seen a bit there. And they know it pretty well, but they've never actually had to read it. And so I can't. This is it. So I'm going back into a kind of a version of the past, the 1890s story in Peru, which I know nothing about, because it allows a completely different kind of writing. And the interesting thing there was these indigenous peoples now, when my daughter found out through the anthropologist about them, apparently they have two senses of time. And before the moment of the arrival of these three Scottish white people who had turned up there and eventually formed a colony growing cocoa, time was completely plural. Time was more to do with geography. You go to certain places to contact ants, whatever. Subsequent to the arrival of these people, time becomes linear. They can say this happened, that happened, this happened. And I think that's quite kind of significant and accidental. And I've tried always, by the ways of writing, to stay in that kind of plural time. You know, that events I'm talking about now that happened in 1970 gardening are equally alive and significant as projections into something that might happen next year.
Any other questions? Something I was quite moved by listening to Andrew speak last Monday when he described travelling or journeying as a means of spending time together.
Yeah. I think that's really important. For all of these projects, one of the great things about it is just that suddenly, you know, because we all lead busy lives, scurrying about, doing our own things, or teaching, whatever, and then suddenly you're out in some wilderness and there's nowhere else to go, and it's a chance to catch up and you know, engage and be with different kinds of people, and that's one of the most important things about it.
Mm-hmm. Just to close then, if there are no more questions, you're very restless. Do you ever see yourself stopping from walking? Do you ever see yourself retiring from journeying and resting?
I can see myself stopping terminally.
Well,
that's kind of part of the energy of it now.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly a book, I'm just finishing a book at the moment for Welcome Trust people about. It's called Living with, their title, not mine, is Living with Buildings, but it is about the nature of the buildings and built structures and how they've affected health of people living within them. And one of the sets of buildings they're looking at is the Pepys Estate in Deptford, which started with what they had is John Betjeman in the 1960s did a helicopter program of flying over the sort of stately homes of Britain, and it finishes up helicopter shots around this new build estate, saying how appalling it was, the people who live here are going to lead lives of terrible health, blah, blah, blah. Well, Andrew Cotting actually lived on this estate when he even was born, and found that the estate, even though it's incredibly run down, was immensely supported, and all of the things he needed for Eden were there, and it was one of the kind of high points of his life. And so essentially, I don't think, you can't make those kind of connections. I follow this through to the Le Corbusier Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, which I've just come back from this week. And Jonathan Meads, who lives there, had no sooner moved in than the building went up in flames. Obviously not a disaster like we're used to, Grenfell Tower, nothing like that, but he had to move out again immediately, and then got a major heart attack. So essentially you created the perfect machine for healthy living and everything, but it doesn't necessarily work out. So those kind of strange connections and stories are what I'm writing about now.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing some of those connections and stories with us today. Thanks, Iain.
Thank you.
Thank you. And can I, on behalf of the School of Anthropology, Conservation and Kent Interdisciplinary Centre Spatial Study, also just to give a general vote of thanks, Iain, for giving your time.
Thank you.
It was immensely rewarding for me personally, and very stimulating, and we go away with lessons and clarifications. So thank you very, very much indeed. What I would like to say is that there will be some people in this room, I have no doubt, who will want to have some conversations with you. I've booked, there was 60 people booked for this event, there's 24 people in the room, so there's a lot of wine up the road in the School of Anthropology and Conservation, which we'll be moving up to, and there will be some light refreshments. So I invite you to come along.
I'll be there in about 10 minutes.
Okay, of course, you're not going to go and look at the tunnel, are you?
I'll come over there. Where we
Exactly, just where we were.
Okay.
If everyone likes to come over if you can, if you have the time. That would be wonderful, thank you.
Another day.